In the early morning hours on September 15, 2004, in Southwick, East Sussex, England, a passerby stumbled upon the body of an elderly woman found along the footpath of a neighborhood. She was lying in a pool of blood. The victim had been viciously stabbed in the back into the side of her neck. Who was this poor defenseless woman, and what kind of monster slashed her to death while she was walking home? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. Each week I explore cases of murder and attempt to unfold the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. As the late poet and playwright Oscar Wilde said in his famous 1889 quote, "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life." Some killers have been inspired by, or one could say their fantasies to commit murder have been triggered by dark fantasy or imagery. Horror films and novels have often been inspired by some of history's darkest true crime stories and real-life serial killers. The serial killer Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, for example, was crafted after the infamous serial killers Ed Gein and Edmund Kemper, amongst other vile infamous offenders. Countless detective books have plots that mirror real FBI cases. As humans, we are equally revolted and drawn into the most macabre and disturbing of stories and crimes. Well, at least most of us listening are. What happens, though, when art imitates life in the most horrifying and bizarre ways? This is the story of Britain's real-life Freddy Krueger spree killer, Daniel Gonzalez. Freddy Krueger was the beginning of it all for me. That is, the character and the movie sparked my passion for horror and interest in all things dark, weird, and macabre. As a child, the original Nightmare on Elm Street was my favorite film. For those younger listeners, the 1980s was a bizarre time. Many parents saw it as perfectly fine to allow their 7-year-old child to watch a burnt child molester who haunted and terrorized children in their dreams from his grave. But a woman's breast shown was far too risque and mature for a child to view. At least that was my upbringing. And so began my strange love affair with Freddy Krueger. I was terrified and enchanted by this character all at once. You could often hear me singing the song. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, you better lock your door. 5, 6, grab a crucifix. 7, 8, gonna stay up late. 9, 10, you'll never sleep again. I own the entire collection of original Nightmare on Elm Street films. I have action figures and clothing, but it is a world of difference between loving and appreciating a horror franchise icon and wanting to become one. For 25-year-old Daniel Gonzalez, this distinction between fantasy and reality was not so clear, and he turned Freddy Krueger into his muse. Daniel Gonzalez was obsessed with the horror movie A Nightmare on Elm Street and similar 80s slasher classics like Friday the 13th. He watched them on repeat. Over time, Daniel Gonzalez's fractured, vulnerable mind would become intertwined with the fantasy worlds of these serial killers, and he dreamed of becoming like them. One morning, while enjoying a stroll with his wife and dog, 61-year-old Peter King was ambushed by a deranged Daniel Gonzalez. Wielding a steak knife, he lunged at Mr. King, screaming at him that he was going to kill him. The older man struggled to shield himself against this crazed young man and his slashing knife. Mr. King's wife and dog shrieked at the chaotic, bloody sight as he stabbed him, and all three of them fought this assailant off. He quickly escaped the crime scene. Daniel had failed at yet another thing in life, since he knew the stabbing was not fatal, and Peter King would survive. Daniel Gonzalez had not been able to live out his dreams of playing slasher for the day, and so with a knife and his hockey mask, he ventured out to Southwick in West Sussex. He waited until nightfall, and there he found the perfect victim, an elderly woman all alone. Marie Harding, a 73-year-old ticket seller in the Brighton and Hove Albion area, was walking back home from visiting her daughter, who lived nearby. Daniel Gonzalez placed the hockey mask over his face, which was by no coincidence exactly like the one Jason Voorhees adorned in the 80s horror classic film, Friday the 13th. Maybe he would have better luck playing Jason, he likely wondered to himself. Daniel Gonzalez held his breath until he could no longer hold back his enthusiasm, and he leapt out at the old woman. He plunged his knife deep into her back and to the side of her neck. He pulled it out, watching her blood spray like a fountain. The elderly woman collapsed to the ground, with blood pooling all around her. Daniel then ran away. This time, he had been victorious, and hopefully now, the voices would calm down. At last he could finally sleep. 2 days passed, and when Daniel Gonzalez woke up, he was excited and anxious to play out his favorite character, Freddy Krueger, again. This time he set off for London to find his next kill. Daniel lurked around the streets of Tottenham High Road until he spotted his next victim. He waited and watched until the moment was just right. Kevin Malloy, a 46-year-old pub landlord, was alone walking around his neighborhood at 5 a.m. Daniel sporadically lunged at the man with his knife, taking him by complete surprise. Holding a large kitchen knife, he stabbed the man an unknown number of times in his face, his neck, and his chest, until he lay dead at Daniel's feet, his body bloody and shredded. He had succeeded again. Kevin Malloy had been killed together by Daniel and Freddy's hands. Around 6:50 a.m. that same day, Daniel crept into the residence of 59-year-old Kuamas Constantino and his wife Christina. The older couple lay peacefully asleep in their bedroom when Kuamas thought he heard a noise downstairs. He quietly nudged and awoke his wife, asking if she had heard the commotion. Christina thought it was likely her elderly mother wandering around the kitchen at night, but Kuamas thought otherwise. He instructed his wife to lock the door behind him while he checked downstairs. Christina refused to leave her husband vulnerable to harm and followed him instead. She saw a man holding a large knife fighting with Kuamas in the corridor. Daniel lashed at the elderly man with his knife multiple times, trying to stab him in the heart. Kuamas hit Daniel, preventing him from stabbing him in the chest, which caused him to slice into his arm instead. Christina ran towards Daniel, fighting off the intruder with her slippers. She flew out of the house, screaming for help. Daniel Gonzalez fled the scene fast, knowing he had failed this time and would have to try again. He traveled to Highgate near North London when Daniel Gonzalez played out his fantasy to be like Freddy Krueger again. He did his best to represent the horror villain's infamous gloved hand. holding a variety of sizes of knives between his excited, shaking fingers. Around 8 a.m. that day, he snuck into the home of 75-year-old retired doctor Derek Robinson and his 68-year-old wife, Jean, an aid worker. They were just finishing up their morning meal when Daniel Gonzalez ran at them, stabbing them in their throats. Derek and Jean Robinson could not escape his erratic, slashing hands. He felt pleased with himself having killed 2 people at one scene. They should be happy with his kills. Maybe they would stop telling him to find more victims, at least for a while. He was exhausted. It was time for Daniel to go home, so he purchased a ticket at Tottenham Court Road Tube Station with a £20 note, stained with the couple's blood. Once police captured Daniel Gonzalez, he shared with law enforcement officers how he wanted to act out his fantasies in real life and be like Freddy Krueger for the day. He told them that he wished to become the greatest serial killer in Britain's history, and he had hoped to have killed at least 10 people. Daniel Gonzalez had expressed to law enforcement how the entire experience of murdering these helpless strangers was orgasmic. It was reported that after his slaying spree, Daniel wrote a series of letters to Zippy, whom he claimed to be his alter ego. He shared with Zippy how killing these people was one of the best days of his life. Daniel Gonzalez discussed how much he and Freddy Krueger were alike now, and that slashing those people to death was one of his greatest life accomplishments. Prosecutor Richard Horwell would use these dark, cold, and evil-sounding statements and letters by the defendant to paint Daniel Gonzalez as a monster. The state set out to show the jury and the judge that the only reason he had killed these innocent people was because he was a cold, detached, evil person. They intended to prove that his vile actions showed that he held no empathy for others, and that fueled by his excessive abuse of drugs and alcohol, he was inspired and driven to kill. The prosecution claimed that Daniel Gonzalez had fully intended to commit multiple murders. They portrayed him as a manipulative and intelligent offender who had no interest in accepting responsibility for his crimes. Prosecutor Richard Howell pointed out to the courtroom how the defendant had bragged about the murders in the letters mentioned. These letters were used to exemplify how depraved and twisted Daniel Gonzalez was. However, to me, they clearly illustrated how truly demented and detached from reality his mental state was at the time of the murders and long before. By the time he had committed these multiple murders, the line between reality and this violent fantasy for him was pretty much non-existent. Daniel's defense counsel argued that Daniel Gonzalez was a diagnosed schizophrenic who was suffering from hallucinogenic commands that instructed him to murder. They wanted him to be found guilty of manslaughter, not first-degree premeditated murder, based on his diminished culpability. During the trial, a psychiatric consultant at Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, Dr. Edward Petch, testified as to the severity of the defendant's mental illness. He witnessed a ferocious attempt made by Daniel Gonzalez to kill himself while awaiting his criminal trial. The defendant had viciously bitten through an artery in his arm. Dr. Edward Petch testified that he had never observed a patient biting themselves with that degree of rage and intensity. He also shared with the court that he believed the defendant was capable of the most extreme and brutal forms of violence, and that his violent behavior did not have to be triggered by something or be premeditated in order for it to happen. Daniel Gonzalez was deemed as being, and I quote, probably the most disturbed patient we have seen in a few years by another member of the staff at the hospital. He required complete isolation from the rest of the patients and mandatory observation by the staff at all times. Although the prosecution believed that Daniel Gonzalez had a personality disorder, they did not think that he had a legitimate mental illness. His extensive mental health records were somehow dismissed as being irrelevant as to what triggered his vicious, maniacal killing spree. These mitigating circumstances made no difference in how Daniel Gonzalez was perceived by the court. Any hope for leniency and punishment by the jury and the judge due to his severe mental illness were a lost cause to the defense. Unfortunately for Daniel Gonzalez and his family, the jury did not believe nor care about his mental illness either. The jury at Old Bailey Court in London returned in only 90 minutes with a unanimous verdict of guilty. They found him guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. Daniel Gonzalez was given 4 life sentences in 2006 for the 4 homicides and 2 additional life sentences for the other 2 attempted murders. He was sent to the high-security Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital in 2007 for the remainder of his days. It wouldn't be until 4 innocent people lost their lives and 2 others were seriously injured that the system would finally pay attention. Even after he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison, eventually being sent to the psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane, the system still failed to help Daniel Gonzalez. While in their care, this extremely mentally ill young man would become consumed with darkness and self-hatred, and this time he directed the rage toward himself. In 2007, while serving his sentence at the high-security psychiatric hospital, Daniel Gonzalez succeeded in taking his own life. He was discovered in his cell, his wrist slashed from the pieces of a broken CD case. Now, some of you may be thinking, good riddance, this guy was a monster. He hunted down and brutally slaughtered the most vulnerable in society, considering that most of his victims were elderly. Why should he be alive in a facility breathing when he took away people's precious loved ones? You would have good reason to feel this way, and I would agree had it not been for the truth of this young man's severely impaired mental state, and how the mental health care system blatantly failed him and his family, and by extension, his future victims. The mass media and the court elected to ignore the fractured mental health of this young man, and instead they chose to paint him as an evil monster, preying on people's grandparents. His mother and others in his life described Daniel Gonzalez as being highly intelligent. He was sensitive. He was not prone to aggression or violence, but he did have some issues at school with teachers not being able to hold his attention. One of his friends from his youth shared on the health site 100families.org about how he had done hard drugs with Daniel Gonzalez many times when they were involved in the rave scene. He talked about how Daniel was funny, kind, and never posed a threat to anyone other than himself. His friend was aware of his struggle with suppression and mental illness, but at the time he didn't think about how destructive it was for Daniel's mental health to be partying so hard. This particular friend was shocked and heartbroken when he heard about how Daniel Gonzalez's mental illness had pushed him so far over the edge that he had ended up killing people. He also expressed that it upset him to see how the media painted him as this evil monster when he knew his old friend Daniel was severely mentally ill. At the time of Daniel Gonzalez's incarceration, he even inquired with his doctors if he thought maybe he should go visit him at the hospital because he was very concerned about his friend. The doctors discouraged him from doing so, fearing that Daniel would pull him into his sick orbit. As Daniel Gonzalez aged, it was noted that he became increasingly more dissociated from society and detached from reality. His mental health had been deteriorating for several years, and both himself, his mother Leslie Savage, and his stepfather Stephen Harper made pleas for help. They reached out to social services, mental health services, and even the police. But no one took their concerns about Daniel's impaired mental state seriously. He was provided with minimal mental health care treatment and was passed around from one group of professionals to the next without any tangible support. Mrs. Savage and her son were told that since he hadn't done anything to raise serious concern, like hurting himself or someone else, there wasn't anything more they could do for him. They were told that the system couldn't justify spending time and resources on someone who had not committed a violent act, nor caused harm to themselves. His condition began to worsen, and their concerns for his sanity continued to escalate. Daniel Gonzalez himself went so far as to write a letter to his general practitioner, begging him for assistance, but he never responded. This is the letter he wrote to his doctor, and I quote, "I really do need help now. I have tried to cope on my own like a normal human being without help or medication, but I have not managed to succeed. I was admitted to hospital in 1998 under Section 37 of the Mental Health Act. I do not want this to happen again, so I really need to go to hospital voluntarily and receive treatment under the care of the doctors before my mental state gets worse. Please help me. This is very urgent. I really, really do need medical help to find the correct environment and the correct medication. I need to take this in a controlled hospital environment. Please, can you help me? I really would appreciate if you would help me improve, as I am in a desperate situation." Once Daniel Gonzalez was arrested for the multiple homicides, he wrote a letter about what happened prior to the murders. This is his letter. "The day before I committed the offenses, I was seen running around Knapp Hill Estate, completely naked, around the shops, past all the pubs and everything, back down the road and all around the estate, completely naked. Yet I wasn't arrested. No social workers or doctors came to see me or anything like that. Nothing was done to prevent that at all. I don't know why I did it, to be honest. I've absolutely no idea. That morning I was punching myself in the face, trying to give myself black eyes, and I did have one black eye. I was just going mad. I've never been that ill before, not even when I committed my offenses. I think it was a mode of self-harm, but in a different type of way. I wanted to degrade myself, self-degradation, to feel better. That's the reason why I did that. I tried to break my nose by jumping face down on the dustbin. I threw myself down the stairs about 3 or 4 times. Anyway, I was running around the state, naked, and everyone saw this. My stepdad called the police. The police didn't come. His stepfather, Stephen Harper, called the police following this incident as he was very concerned about Daniel's self-harming and very strange behavior. Mr. Harper informed them that his stepson was a paranoid schizophrenic who was not currently on any medication, was behaving irrationally, was running around naked in town, and kept trying to break his own nose. The police never responded or showed up at their house. Only a few weeks before her son completely snapped and murdered several people, Mrs. Savage had written to social services, begging them for their help. In the letter she wrote, and I quote, "Does my son have to commit murder to get help?" Yet no one from social services ever came to help him. Daniel Gonzalez, his mother and stepfather, all knew that he was about to unravel. Daniel Gonzalez had first been admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1998, where he was diagnosed at age 17 with paranoid schizophrenia. Northwest Surrey Mental Health Facility had treated him for the last 7 years. Yet nobody did anything beneficial to help his condition. He was never placed on antidepressants or antipsychotics to help keep his symptoms under control. The Surrey and Borders Partnership NHS Trust was defensive in its response to how their approach had failed regarding his mental health care. They claimed that there was no way his crimes could have been predicted, much less prevented, when there had been no history of violence. This was not the end of the controversy surrounding Daniel Gonzalez's inadequate mental health care treatment. Once he killed himself, an investigation into his mental health care was launched by an independent organization. A report in 2009 stated that findings by the NHS, Southeast Coast, and Surrey County Council declared his treatment and care to be insufficient. They concluded that his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was not treated successfully. Health professionals failed to engage with him at all, and that it was a matter of missed opportunities to help this extremely sick young man. Over the 7 years he was treated, he met with doctors and psychiatrists almost 60 times. Although the report concluded that their care of his mental health was insufficient, unsuccessful, and would never have been beneficial given their approach to treatment, they also didn't believe the doctors could have predicted his potential to commit such heinous, violent crimes. This may be true to some extent, but it can't be denied that there were so many warning signs, including direct requests for help from the offender. Daniel Gonzalez and his family's cries for help were just ignored. This young man was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and his hallucinogenic episodes were worsening. He sat in his parents' house most of the day, alone. He didn't have a job to go to or any friends to talk to. He just had his horror films and computer games to keep him company. He drank and smoked marijuana all day and night, barely sleeping, watching very violent slasher films, and playing violent video games. Isolated, the voices began to come more often. So he stopped fighting them, began to listen, and he planned. Daniel Gonzalez decided that he was going to be just like Freddy Krueger and kill as many people as he possibly could. However, unlike countless other brutal killers, Daniel Gonzalez immediately expressed his regret and remorse for the harm he had caused. When he was arrested, he broke down in front of the police officers, crying about how sorry he was for the murders he committed. When he confessed to the murders and the brutal attacks on the other victims, Daniel Gonzalez said, and I quote, "I am sorry, I just want to get locked up. In fact, I should go into the electric chair." Yet somehow this was not presented as evidence in his trial. When he was locked up at Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, he shared with a psychiatrist that he believed he would be released in no more than 10 years. His expression that it was orgasmic to murder these people, and then breaking down in sorrow and regret over what he had done, showed his deranged and broken mental state. His conveying that he deserved to die for his crimes, but that he also thought he'd be free sooner than later, is a further indicator of his split mind. It is possible that he even had multiple personalities because he seemed as if he were two, if not more, radically different people. There is no record or information as to what trauma or abuse Daniel Gonzalez may have suffered from in his childhood or adolescence that could have brought on his disease, or if it was simply a genetic predisposition. From all the research I found, though, it seemed like his family genuinely loved and supported him, and they did everything they could to help. Individuals who struggle with the profound psychological challenges of schizophrenia experience great difficulty in maintaining a clear identity and a grounded sense of self. It is widely established in the study of schizophrenia that a disturbed self-identity is at the core of many patients' suffering. The most prevalent symptoms of the disorder include delusions, hallucinations, apathy, lack of emotional reaction, and the disorganization of both thoughts and speech. Delusions of grandeur are a known common symptom of those on the psychotic spectrum disorder, which includes schizophrenia. The individual holds false beliefs about their worth, their power, mission in life, or even identity, although there is clear, indisputable evidence to prove otherwise. It is the second most commonly experienced type of delusional belief, with roughly half of those diagnosed with schizophrenia claiming to experience them, and 2/3 of individuals diagnosed with bipolar disorder experiencing them. Yet the research on this has been minimal. Its origin is found within the autobiographical memory, and for someone suffering from a psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia, this is highly likely to be a blend of true life experiences and fantasy. A person may believe that they are a celebrity, a deity, or even a fictional character. This can lead the person to act and behave in irrational, erratic, confusing, dangerous, and potentially violent ways. Unlike individuals with narcissistic personality disorder who also have grandiose delusions, this is more closely connected to mania and is not related to arrogance. It more than often manifests itself in forms of paranoia and hallucinogenic auditory commands, making the experience terrifying for the person and potentially very harmful for them and others. Does this mean that Daniel Gonzalez should be given proper psychiatric care and released in 5 years? Of course not. But should he be locked up with other violent murderers who are not delusional and suffering from a severe mental health illness? This man desperately sought out medical intervention, as did his mother and stepfather, yet their cries for help were ignored by the mental health care system in Great Britain. Doesn't that make the mental health care system at least a little responsible for his crimes? Daniel Gonzalez was a very mentally ill person, and even though he wanted to change, his needs were simply brushed aside. As a result, his mind spiraled into the darkest and most disturbing of places. He clutched onto a character to emulate so he could grasp some semblance of control and power. Now, regarding his emulation of a violent fictional character, although I can't find any specific research on particularly violent characters, there appears to be a strong correlation between individuals with borderline personality disorder or schizophrenia and their relationship with the fantasy world. It is relatively common for those who have been diagnosed as such to feel as if they are stuck between their real lives and those of fiction. When someone feels this way, this can help facilitate their connection to a fictional or fantasy character. As a result, they may mirror the behaviors, characteristics, personality, and even physical traits of that character. So if an individual is connecting with a violent fantasy character, it stands to reason that their muddled perception of reality could lead them to act out their violent fantasies without fully understanding that their actions are real. There is also the element of Daniel Gonzalez being hyper-exposed to violent media, in particular slasher horror films and violent video games. The effects of violent media on the mind, in particular on the youth, has been an area of study for more than half a century, with contradictory results. One side shows evidence that depictions of aggression and violence can have adverse effects on the brain, especially for a child or youth whose cognitive development is in a critical early stage. The other side of study shows evidence that it does not increase the likelihood of violent behavior. Both sides do seem to agree, though, that it can have a negative impact on an individual's psyche who is prone to aggressive and violent behavior, and those who are mentally ill. However, this is usually studied on the level of minimal violence, such as kicking or hitting. It does not address the chances of committing homicide, much less brutal mass murder. I understand that the brutal murders he committed could not have been predicted, and therefore these 4 deaths could not have been prevented. There is no way to know for sure whether or not Daniel Gonzalez would have killed someone else at some other point due to his mental illness. However, it can't be denied that Daniel Gonzalez and his mother and stepfather attempted to prevent these violent acts from ever happening. He wrote a letter begging to be admitted to the psychiatric hospital because he was terrified of what was happening inside his mind. And he desperately wanted their help. When such a plea made by a mentally ill person is ignored by so-called doctors and healthcare professionals, those involved should be held partially responsible, at least morally so, for neglecting a patient's request for help. Their treatment programs and operations should be placed under a microscope, if not completely eradicated. I find it disgusting that they ignored him and his mother and stepfather's cries for help. And I hope they feel some guilt at the end of the day for their roles in this tragedy. This case is just another reminder, another tragic example of how violence may have been prevented if there had been proper psychiatric care available for the mentally ill. There are countless examples of people in the United Kingdom, the United States, and way too many countries where if the stricken individuals had been treated with the care and medication they needed, their lives and others may have been saved. Great strides in awareness in the last decade have been made in this area. The overall comfort level and openness of mental health conversations have increased, but still, there remains a stigma around mental health, especially toward the most severe of disorders like schizophrenia. This continues to degrade the quality and accessibility of our mental health care institutions. We fail to make it a priority in our society, and because of this, there will be countless other acts of violence and tragic, brutal murders to come that maybe, just maybe, could have been prevented. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think that if the mental health care system had provided Daniel Gonzalez with the help he so desperately wanted and needed, these 4 innocent lives could have been saved? Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I am beyond thrilled to be your host. If you have any suggestions, comments, or ideas you'd like to share with me, please reach out. My contact information you can find in the episode description. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder was created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music composed by Stereo Code.